Well, first is business. Next time we're supposed to meet is Thanksgiving. We won't meet Thanksgiving, but we will meet 3 successive weeks after Thanksgiving, unless anybody has any great objections to that. And in the 3 successive weeks after that, we'll take a long break for Christmas and for me to get a chance to ponder more of all of this. We lost everything last week. I don't know what I'm going to do about all of that. I just have to leave it into the ethers. All right, we got through the prologue last time. We made great progress. And pretty soon we're going to break into the clear and go very fast, but it won't be tonight. The thing that is fascinating about life to me is that we always get exactly what we want. If we need to undo ourselves with a heart attack, we attract ourselves to just the food that we need. Or if we need to have an accident, we go down just exactly the pathway that we need to meet the accident. It's not just some replay of a destiny that has been played out. And it's not just a déjà vu, a fast pre-knowing of something. It's something much deeper than that. It's something that proceeds all the way to the absolute and the supreme being in the absolute. We're going to try and be a little bit deeper tonight than we have been, and a little bit more mathematical. It's a universal principle, and it's a principle that goes beyond just mere human existence. There is a common unity between being and the absolute unknown. And the only way that that common connection can exist between spirit and that which is and isn't is consciousness. The word consciousness is the only thing that I can think of in our language that describes the connection. We don't mean only waking consciousness. It includes semi-consciousness or pre-consciousness or subconsciousness and even a kind of unconsciousness, but not a non-consciousness. There is that unity of consciousness that wakes up. And the relationship between the known and the unknown, or between being and non-being, is very much like a profile or like a silhouette. So that reality or waking reality and what it needs to become more of itself is described exactly in its interface to the unknown. And it's very, it's like the yin and the yang, that they each describe a reality of light and being astutely awake, and a reality of something that is asleep or dark or completely unknown. And that interface between them is something like a gateway. It's like we describe ourselves in our being, and in that description or in that assertion, we produce a contour that is like a question. The statement of being is the statement of what we are not. And in that statement of what we are not, there is a question of what is it that we aren't. And so the two things interact perfectly. The sooner we can realize in ourselves this profile of what we need and actively work with it rather than stumbling in the dark and having to be forced into waking consciousness, sometimes shocked into it, the quicker our spiritual life goes. The more we awaken, the more pleasant it is, and the more we can actually do. Now, one of my favorite experiences of this principle of wanting exactly what we need is the example of a little child. At a certain age, a child wants to hear a story over again and again and again and again. The book gets worn out, the parent gets worn out, and feels like it can't do it one more time, but the child wants that. Like it or not, repetition is absolutely necessary for the physical and even the psychological health of that little being that is coming into existence. At the age when this demand for repetition is there, the new etheric vital body is being coaxed into birth. And that etheric vital body is made and works through and is organized, is developed and nurtured through rhythmic waves of repetition. Things are done over again and again and again, and in the repetition, when things flow over again and again, a strength develops. In a plant-like state of existence, everything is repetition. It's the same thing over and again, no variety. In everything, even in the adult, in the organization and the growth and the appreciation of soul material in our vital body, in the higher ethers, the same thing is necessary. It is through rhythmic repetitions, chantings, prayings, doing the same thing again and again, that we organize the new experiences we've had and that we incorporate them into us. There's something about repetition, if it doesn't become a vain repetition, as long as it's live and fresh and new each time, that it makes us very strong. Everything, and this is one of the reasons nature is so undefeatable, is because nature has this rhythm that goes on and on and on. The whole study of astrology is the study of cycles. It's never, ever the same again. The innocent child seems to unconsciously look for repetition. In the antiquity of humanity, the same was true. That people wanted the stories, the same stories over again and again. So that if you get into ancient scriptures, even in Greek times and even more so back in Vedic times, they're just filled with repetitions. It seems almost ceremonial. Something will be stated and then there will be a ceremonial repetition of it, sometimes from a number of different points of view. The further we go back in history, the more repetition we find. The same is true in the drama of Oedipus the king. Sophocles' story, no sooner has the prologue finished when the Parodos, P-A-R-O-D-O-S, begins. And the parodos was the first of the courses. That is, when the large chorus sang and divided itself into two groups and went around the circular stage as strophe and antistrophe, one part singing, another part giving a counterpoint to it. Sometimes they went in geometric formations with each other, but it was a call and chant. The parodos eventually evolved even in Greek times. The parodos it began as a simple summation of the story. Even though the prologue has just told you what the story is going to be, the parodos came along and gave you a simple poetic summation. And eventually, as people were becoming more sophisticated and self-conscious, they didn't like so much the repetition anymore. Bright people, unless they're very spiritually inclined, seem to be, a repetition seems to be anathema to them. They're bored easily, and that's certainly a sign of vanity right away. Not only are they bright, but they're vain about it. But the parodos then evolved into what we now call a parody. It became a form of its own, in that it was a light retelling of the story that was very light and very funny. And so it became, they even put staged parodies at the end of the ancient Greek times. So, the strophe and antistrophe, the chorus, represented the populace. It represented all of the people collectively of humanity. In some cases, it represented groups of furies, large groups of people. But in any case, they always sang out the story. I'm going to read the parodos, even though I'm a terrible reader. I'll go ahead and read it anyway. Because it gets us to our second side trip of the night. It can just be, everything's in threes tonight. 3 side trips, the third of which will be major. The strophe begins, "What is the god singing in his profound Delphi of gold and shadow? What oracle for Thebes, the sun-whipped city? Fear unjoints me, the roots of my heart tremble. Now I hear, O healer, your power and wonder. Will you send doom like a sudden cloud, or weave it like a nightfall of the past? Ah, no, be merciful. Issue of holy sound, dearest to our expectancy, be tender." Then the antistrophe comes, "Let me pray to Athena, the immortal daughter of Zeus, and to Artemis, her sister, who keeps her famous throne in the market ring, and to Apollo bowman at the far butts of heaven. O gods, descend. Like 3 streams leap against the fires of our grief, the fires of darkness. Be swift to bring us rest. And as in the old time from the brilliant house of air you stepped to save us, come again." In the second strophe, "Now our afflictions have no end. Now all our stricken host lies beneath, and no man fights off death with his mind. The noble plowman bears no grain, and groaning mothers cannot bear. See how our lives like birds take wing, like sparks that fly when a fire soars to the shore of the god of evening." In the second antistrophe, "The plague burns on, it is pitiless. Though pallid children laden with death lie unwept in the stony ways, and old gray women by every path flock to stand about the altars, there to strike their breasts and cry worship of Zeus in wailing prayers. Be kind, God's golden child. There are no swords in this attack by fire, no shields, but we are ringed with cries. Send the besieger plunging from our homes into the vast sea room of the Atlantic, or into the waves that foam eastward of Thrace. For the day ravages what the night spares. Destroy our enemy, O Lord of this thunder. Let him be riven by lightning from heaven. In the final antistrophe, Phoebus Apollo stretched the sun's bowstring, that golden cord, until it sing for us, flashing arrows in the heaven. Artemis huntress, race with flaring lights upon our mountains. O scarlet god, O golden banded brow, O Theban Bacchus in a storm of Maenads, whirl upon death that all undying hate. Come with the blinding torches, come in joy. And as they're finishing up, Oedipus comes back out of the castle. But before we actually get to what Oedipus does, I want to look a little bit at the prologue. The thing that I noted, and which really indicates to me, is in the repetition. Because if you have someone who is an initiate like Sophocles, what an initiate repeats is worthy of listening to. And what is repeated here is the close connection between fire and illness. And most often the fire is not a visible fire. It is an invisible fire that is burning and bringing all of the agony to the people. At first this seems a little strange, but it really isn't. Because as far back as we can go into any mythology or into any mystic poetry, the two primary creative elements are fire and water. Whether it is the fire of the light of consciousness as it manifests in the womb, the water womb of space, those are the two primary elements. They relate to fire, to time and to space, and they relate to spirit and to matter. In fire, there is sort of a timeless time that happens as quick as a flash, and in water, we have the quality that it takes centuries to smooth off a stone from a jagged state until it's extremely smooth. Flame itself is jagged, whereas water is smooth and reflective. Suns form and they shine in a sea of space, and that sea of space reflects back to them. Will creates and imagination informs. It is true that fire eventually consumes all of the forms, but it is also the source of all of the forms. And the forms that it consumes are of its own making and are its own fuel. The sunlight of many, many years becomes the wood that heats us through a winter. So there is a big difference then between a creative life, a very, very vital life, and a world of timeless form. Out of the sea all forms come, and all forms become eternal, and they become changeless. If we live in the world of forms, and if we are water people, we love those forms as as they are, and we cherish them and we cling to them, especially in our fall when we have closed ourselves off from most of the creative fire. We want things in the material world to be exactly the way they are all the time. This is why Coca-Cola and all of the things that are really not foods in a grocery store have such appeal, because the experience of form, you know you're going to get exactly the same thing each and every time. And there is something about that is very secure. It's very comforting. We even have our language that we say that somebody is hot with creativity, or we say that somebody is lovingly warm. Or on the other side of things, on the formal side of things, the opposite of the sun is Saturn. We say that somebody is coldly malicious or coolly indifferent, so that where the source of the light and the life and the wisdom comes from, it's always associated with fire and with heat. This is true even in the material world, because the very elements of this stuff are really condensed sunlight. We're not just talking only about the spiritual worlds. They are more antecedent, and even the sunlight is like a form relative to the spiritual worlds, but this is condensed sunlight. So there would be, without flame, there would be no new forms, there would be no new experience. And so rhythmically, wave after wave, and sometimes arrhythmically, light issues, and it issues to change things, to create, to do new things, to experience. Hence it is that in our attachment to forms, in our selfishness where we identify ourselves with the creation rather than with the Creator, and where we hang on to things, when the fire comes through us, it comes as disease. Not merely as a fever, not merely as an inflammation, but as a disease. Because we would like to have it cool and smooth and even all the time. From the material point of view, the proverbial hell is described as a sea of fire. But that also happens to be the most spiritual place. And the reason we burn is because we're still attached to forms or formation rather than being attached to the creative source of fire. And there are two main points in this. Number one, that disease is not really our enemy. It is our friend, our very creative friend, and in that silhouette, it shows exactly where we are attached. Where we're not even getting the most out of the unknown because we can't digest the unknown or the forms of the unknown if we want them to stay the same all the time. Disease indicates that deep within us something is ready for a change, and it's going to come whether we like it or not. The second thing is that everything is healed through fire, meaning to say that every illness, no matter what it is, can be greatly augmented by creative activity. And when we take ill, as terrible as it may seem and as weak as we may be, this is the time that we should activate our inwardness and draw on healing as a flame. There are all sorts of imbalances in our being, where some things we speed up too much. We have hyperactive systems, and some things we slow down too much, and we have hypoactive states. We could get into the whole, if action or energy is the product of that fire, that spiritual fire, we could get into all of the diseases relative to the places in ourselves where we hold back or where we push forward. But that is really too big to go into. But I just wanted to point out how clear it is that Sophocles knew that fire was our friend and that fire produced illness. And I had to bring a poem in. As long as I'm going to disgrace myself by reading, I'm going to do it in a good way. And it's a little Rumi poem. It's one of my very most favorite of all Rumi poems. If you are a friend of God, fire is your water. You should wish to have 1,000 sets of moth wings so you could burn them away one set a night. The moth sees the light and goes into the fire. You should see fire and go towards light. Fire is what of God is consuming. Water, world protecting. Somehow each gives the appearance of the other. To those eyes you have now, what looks like water burns. What looks like fire is a great relief to be inside. My favorite of all Rumi poems, I think. All right, we have done. We're breezing right along. We're already through the second side trip. And now we get to the main theme, and we're going to spend all the rest of the night, which may not be long. What we're going to deal with is very concentrated, and I'm trying to deal with issues that I've never dealt with before, and I'm trying to grow up in some regards. And in doing that, I'm tying together and finishing off or filling out thoughts that I've had for quite a few years now, so I can still go back to the fundamental things, but I'm trying to apply them to different topics. But as the chorus is finishing singing the Paroutos, Oedipus comes out of the palace and comes on to the stage, which is the courtyard in front of the palace, and the scene begins. The play then takes the form of call and response. And call and response was the most primitive form of drama, and probably the most primitive form of all artistic interaction, probably going back to the time of divine priests who would call out and the congregation of people would call back, and they would be unified in their focus on the one. There are solo lines. This is something that is our general theme for the night, and it is on the problem of call and response, and the problem of call and response as it relates to knowledge, as it relates to politics, and as it relates to spiritual philosophy through spiritual mathematics of triangles. The form of call and response dominated all of Greek drama during the several hundred years that it flourished. Eventually, as many as 3 or 4 actors were differentiated from the chorus, but it began with just one. Now, this is an artistic device that, if you look at it, still continues to this day. All of our music, popular music, religious music, follows the same thing. That is, there is a melody line or a story line, a solo part where a story is developed. But only so much of a story can be developed at a time, only so much individuation can take place without there becoming insecurity or without one being taken away from the whole or the masses, and then we go into what is called the refrain, which in a lot of music is still called the chorus, so that there are verses and choruses. Now, what happens in the Oedipus story is that Oedipus is asking questions of the populace of Cadmus, or the populace of Thebes, and he's asking for counsel from them. It is both ways. In one way, he's the questioner trying to draw the populace out, and in another way, he is the divine authority that is speaking the truth and is the center of them. Now, this is something that deals with an illusion and a fallacy that is present at the same time that there is a great spiritual truth. I think I've said it a number of times that every great spiritual truth has mimicking it an illusion that appears like it, or that tends to dupe us, that all of the symbols of black magic are very much like the symbols of loving creative magic, only in one small detail. The logical fallacy is called classically argumentum ad populum. It means that we appeal to the masses for the truth. We appeal to the numbers, to the hoi polloi, to know what the truth is. It's saying that if everybody believes it, it must be true. And that's really a logical fallacy. It doesn't say very much for democracy, does it? The illusion that is in it is something that is called common sense. It is as if to say that there is a truth that resides in everyone, and that if we can find out what that truth is that is in everyone, we'll know it. Very often common sense is humbug, but very often it isn't. So the questions we're asking ourselves: is there any reason to believe in statistics? Are public opinion polls all bogus, or surveys, or anything like that? Are they true? Do they have anything to say for themselves? Is it right because the public wants it? Being very strong individualists and individuating people in our spiritual journey, our first inclination is to emphatically say no. That because the will of the people has spoken, it doesn't have anything to do with truth. Nothing to do with truth at all. But then why does it persist? Why do people want to influence the masses? Not just vainly. Almost every spiritual teacher that I've seen has always tried to influence more and more people, and has always tried to find a truth in more and more people. So the question that we're looking at is, why in call and response does the divine king go to the people for the truth? Or why does democracy dominate as a political philosophy in our times? It's no fallacy to understand that one individual who is intuitive and very well thought out and very much in tune with the divine, like a divine king or like a creative being, is worth very much more than the opinions of 10,000 ignorant people who never think, never pray, never in any way unite themselves with the divine. That's understood. But why do we look into the masses then? Why do we have a democracy? Again, we're in something I'm way over my head. My mother and father both said it. My father still says it, that I always have eyes that are bigger than my stomach, and that I always bite off much more than I can chew. But I do little hits now and then and carry them as far as I can, and eventually I'll get somewhere. I'm an eternalist. I won't give up. And I hope in bringing these things out that they awaken thoughts in other people. And there's nothing I like better when somebody comes back for years. Mark has always come back with me to me with thoughts that I have put out, and he'll come back and he'll have carried them further, and it's really nice. But at any rate, our Declaration of Independence says that we have an inalienable right to freedom. The freedom to choose our governance and to choose our own destiny, where we're going. In the Constitution that is founded on the Declaration of Independence, there are all sorts of checks and balances, and many of them are tripartite. Many of them are based on the very triangular mythology that we're looking into, but we're not going to go into that. But there are all kinds of checks and balances between the individual freedom and the individual right and the individual responsibility versus the collective, versus the freedom of the masses. When does the social right take precedence over the individual, and vice versa? This is a continuously evolving thing, that there are times in the cycles when individuation holds sway, and at those times there's a lot of stress on individual freedom. And then there are times when the consciousness switches to an awareness of a need to act collectively and to act unitedly as a social unity, and then the things go back to the collective freedom again. But it's a very difficult, very huge topic. The other freedom that is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence is the fundamental equality of all humans. All self-conscious human beings are fundamentally equal. We both know that is true, and we know that it is not true. I can't possibly begin to talk about all of these things, but I'm trying to wheedle you into my mania with mathematical philosophy, and so I'll begin by talking about some of them. In the simplest logical form, there are only three logical types of government. Government by one, government by some, and government by all. Fairly simple. Historically, this has been called monarchy. By some, it's been called aristocracy or oligarchy or something like that. And by all, it's been called democracy. Even in socialism, it's a democratic thing that everybody who's socially part of one society is one. In reality, that is, in non-political or non-artificial human terms, all three forms of government exist, and they must exist. From the spiritual point of view, they could be called the forms of government of body, soul, and spirit, or a form evolution. Oh, how would you say it? What do I use as a word in here? Life, in the very broad sense. In our bodies, especially our physical bodies, they are the most complete expression of our history as evolving creative beings. Everything that we've learned in all of our incarnations as humans, in our animal-like state, in our plant-like state, in our mineral state, all of those things are in our bodies. They are a direct expression of where we stand right now, the sum total of our formal experience. They are our most final form of expression of character. The character that we in spirit have developed is expressed in our bodies. They are extremely intimate, and there are books like just a few years ago, was a lovely book called Our Bodies, Ourselves. But they are tailor-made. They are perfect resonances of when we express our will to be, our will to experience. Our physical bodies are that. All our bodies are that. And for that reason, our bodies are inalienably ours. We are king, divine king within our body. No one has the right to nudge us out or to take over our bodies or anything like that. All such things like possession or mediumship, or no matter how great the whole notion may be, it still is fundamentally monarchy is the government for the body. And the more that the monarchy is asserted, the better the body functions, and the better it is as a vehicle for experience. The stronger the assertion of a unified character, the more all the disparate forces and elements that compose the body work together. The more, if there is a really certain action, if we do with full intent and full integrity, if we live in our body in that way, our body becomes a marvelous expression of us. So it functions better the more monarchical it is. Now, aristocracy is probably not the best word. Probably a combination between a Buddhist term and a Egyptian term would be best. Hierarchy or meritocracy, because the fallacy of thinking that we are all equal in an evolutionary sense, in a sense of change, is obvious. It's clear that some people are much more evolved, and, we all have the village idiot be the school teacher. That's clearly the case, that as we unfold evolutionary consciousness, as we unfold the ability to do things and understand the divine plan, then more responsibility and more facility comes upon us, and there is a meritocracy. And I'm not talking only about humans, because to a large extent, it happens with all of the evolutionary kingdoms. The creators have more responsibility for the creatures the deeper they are in their spiritual evolution. This goes on and on. In fact, one of the most beautiful parts of the Bible is when it talks about in the book of Revelation that when our eyes are opened and when we let go of our vain illusions about our personal selves and we can objectively see the truth and see the light that shines more or less bright. How does the Bible say it? It says something to the effect, they shall be seen and they will be asked to step forth as leaders. Something of that order, like the adepts or the people who really are fit to not govern or rule, but direct or suggest the direction of evolution. Some people will just recognize that, hey, this person knows more than I do. And it isn't just knowledge. You know what I'm trying to say? It's more like a spiritual Gnostic. So then there is in the region of soul, some things are more important than other things. And the more we can understand the hierarchy of what is important in us and what is closest to the truth as far as the purpose, the reason we exist, the more we are then ready for something like a aristocratic type of society, because relative to evolution, it is true. When we reach the spirit, when everything of evolution falls away, when we contemplate ourselves, the oneness, and we return as close as we possibly can to the Spirit, we recognize that in Spirit, each and every one of us is equal, because each and every one of us is an exact reflection or replication in spirit of the divine, of the one. It is true that the one has much more soul power and much more evolutionary experience, but the deeper we contemplate ourselves, the more deeply we contemplate the one, and the more we contemplate God, and the differences are inseparable. Or as Meister Eckhart says, God needs me as much as I need God. And there is that very, very close unity and identity between one and one. How does the call and response song go? One is one and all alone, and evermore shall be its own. I get a little too nervous to sing when I'm talking. So it is true that in spirit, the proper form of government is democracy. There is unity. And it is that we want to spend all the rest of the night talking about, is how that unity is distributed, how it is distributed among the many, to what end, and how that truth works out so that there is a truth in the masses. Now, both Sophocles and Plato were Eleusinian initiates, and Plato was part of the Orphic Mystery School. And in the Orphic Mystery School, they contemplated this problem very, very deeply. It was called the problem of the one and the many. And when the library at Alexandria was destroyed, a lot of the schools were saved, and they fell into the hands of Muslims. And to this day, yet, a large part of the mystical and theological pondering of Islamic mystics and scholars is on the problem of the one and the many. It's really interesting how much Platonism came into Islam, because the character of Islam itself is not Platonistic. The character of Christianity is. But I guess they needed a good dose of it, so that even the Enneads are very much the thing of the Muslims. Obviously, since we came to this by understanding the distribution of identity and our relationship to identity, this has a lot to do with the problem of self. So we're going to look at the problem of self some. Now, since this is a series of talks that is on the mythology and spiritual philosophy of triangles, it seems appropriate, which means here it comes, like it or not, we're going to pursue this in terms of the spiritual mathematics of triangles. And we're going to have profound pictures tonight. This is our first profound picture. If we have one point, we have one-dimensional consciousness. The Pythagoreans called the point being in position, something like that. What is one-dimensional consciousness is what we should ask ourselves, because the simplest things that we learned in arithmetic, once we learned how to count and add and subtract, we forgot about what we were doing. Simply stated, one-dimensional consciousness means that we know one thing. One point in space, one moment in time. Nothing else. Just one point or one time. Which is another way of saying all we know is here. Location. We don't know if that is as large as a cosmos or as small as a mere location. We just know here. And we just know now. And we don't know whether that now is an eternity or whether it is just an instant. It's certainly more undeniable than any relative truth that we can think of. But one-point consciousness is not knowledge. It's experience, but it is not knowledge. We know just one thing. It is exceedingly internal consciousness. The one just knows itself, and there is no outside. There is just one. Linear consciousness is different. With linear consciousness, we have 2 points. And it's a vastly different consciousness. It is a consciousness of relativity. Or it just means that we know that there is here and there is there. Or there is now and there is then. We don't know whether here or there is close or far, or past or present. We just know that there is now and then, and there is here and there. It's a very limited, it's a plant-like consciousness. Plants grow in a line, basically, and it grows toward a point. It grows from a point, from a seed toward a point. That point is the sun. This is referential consciousness. The consciousness of existence is referred to something outside of ourselves. But where that is also unknown. With linear consciousness, there is also no knowledge, or the knowledge is relative. We're relatively near or we're relatively far away. We don't know anything except that. This is I and thou consciousness. There is a potential to how far we can set the points apart, how far we can polarize, how far we can extend. So this is extensive consciousness in the same way that point consciousness is intensive consciousness. The point consciousness thrives on simplicity and internalization rather than extending. So it's a kind of experience that is referential and it's relative, but it is also tantalizing and frustrating. Now, we tend to look down on point consciousness, and we tend to look down on linear consciousness, but it shouldn't be that way. Because each of these consciousnesses, types of consciousness, varieties of consciousness, is capable of great profundity. We know that mystical consciousness is momental consciousness. It is the consciousness of a moment. So that we can enter into a point, be it in time or space or both, so that we see that point to the entirety of the cosmos. It's ineffable what we experience, but in point-like consciousness, it can be very profound. Rudolf Steiner, for example, says that eventually all music will be referred to one note. Quite a bit of music is that way anyway, in that eventually our music will be getting more and more into one note. Because if you think about it, the same note put in different melodies or put in different harmonies has all kinds of different meanings. And if we can, without having to go on those delineations, which is again a linear consciousness, or without having to go on sweeps of delineations in harmony, if we can go right into that note and experience all of those possibilities, hear all of the different melodies that a note could be in at the same time, that's a profound consciousness. The same is true that if one goes to the paradoxical extremes of delineation, one can also come to an extremely profound consciousness. If we look at something like Lao Tzu, all of that mysticism is based on paradox. And that's all two-point consciousness, and it's very, very extreme. So both of them result, if followed to their fullest, they result in a very high degree of consciousness, but not knowledge. If we add a third point, we have knowledge. With 3 points, everything is all different. It doesn't matter where in the plane we put them or where in time we put them, we have a sense of past and future relative to now. And we know relative to those 2 points, we know exactly where we are. There isn't a vague relativity known relative to one thing. There is a definition. It is, as long as point C knows how far it is to point B, and how far it is to point A, and how far B is from A, it knows. And it knows everything in between. Because this is a compounding, these are each of the vertices is a point. If the points are compounded with lines, it produces a figure, and not only do we know C relative to B and A, we know everything within A and B. So this is a product then, or a compound of the other kinds of consciousness. It results in a completely distinct kind. It has the relativity in each line, but it isn't a relative consciousness, it is an objective consciousness. And the internality of the point is also objectified, in that the region of knowing experience has an internality, and the unknown is everything outside of the triangle. So there is an objective awareness of what is and what isn't, the known and the unknown. Every point within that triangle is part of what is known. We could take and compound this and go into another dimension and produce planes and bring the quality of depth in, which is a totally different kind of consciousness, which is going within the within of the triangle, and it leads to an even greater kind of objectivity, but that's not the intent. I'm trying to get to here in the simplest way possible to the idea of objective knowledge. This is so objective that all recognition of where we are in space, whether it is done by measuring particles in physics or whether it is done by measuring the distances of galaxies, or whether we navigate ships or whether we navigate spaceships, all of it is done by this principle, which is called triangulation. You only know where you are when you have 3 points. It brings on a kind of consciousnth that you can know. It isn't just you and I. It is you and I and something that stands outside of you and I that is both part of us and something of its own, and that in itself produces an objectivity about you and I. But I also produce an objectivity about you and it. You see what I mean? It's a revolving kind of consciousness. Now, in the first talk that we had in this series, we talked about the arithmetic equivalent of this. Instead of talking about lines and directions and points in space, which is basically geometric, we counted. We counted 1, 2, 3. This is very much like saying that in the one, or in the beginning, it doesn't even pay to even talk about a beginning, but that being experienced existence, that is where waking starts. Waking exists because being experiences existence. It doesn't make any difference whether it is the Supreme Being, or you, or I, or Descartes. It probably is much deeper for the Supreme Being than for me, but it still is the experience of existence. And though people would like to say, as they say about Descartes' notion of it all, well, how do we know it isn't a dream or an illusion? You can't state anything like that because all of those things are based on the recognition or the awareness of existence. So that is the number one, or the original consciousness of unity is such that it knows that it exists. But it doesn't have an itness to it, there is just existence. But in this knowledge, it realizes there is a potential for more existence, or there is a potential for non-existence. So that as soon as there is a realization of existence, there is automatically a realization of non-being, of what it isn't. Immediately, as soon as you know something or experience something, there's insecurity. And this results in a pseudo-dualism. But because it is the one consciousness, which is like point consciousness, that realization is internalized. And there is division within. And so there is a recognition of a duality within oneness in the very deepest realization of oneness itself. Now, at that time, we give all the standard names for all of these things. We said that the state of non-being was called the absolute, and that it was symbolized usually by silence or blackness. And that the one was normally called the Supreme Being. And the internal externalization of duality of being and not being became an internal divine father-mother. The apparent external absolute being, or para-being, or quasi or pseudo-external, as the absolute, has in most mysticisms been called the Black Madonna. Whereas the internal mother, the source of the differentiation, has always been called the White Goddess, whereas the internal father has always been an invisible father. Now I want to look at this in a slightly different way, because we're starting to get near to our topic, and we'll be done with the tedium before too long. In fact, this whole talk should end up all the tedium. It's deep and it's very fundamental, but I think we have to go into that. When being experiences its existence or existence, that comes from a waking to it, which in itself comes from the will to be. It's like saying the one wakes up in zero by the will to be. And the will to be is indeed exceedingly powerful, because everything that exists, and even in our very infantile understanding of the cosmos as a far-flung bunch of matter, there's extreme power there. But what we don't realize is how extremely subtle it is. It's subtle to all experience but the experience of being, or the experience of existence. subtlety and power go hand in hand. And that divine will is associated with paternity. Its realization comes from an internal division, and that internal division of what it is not, which is really it itself, is seen as a spiritual feminine. And so that the realization of what it is not into what it is, which is the whole process of waking up to more and more and more truth and light. And it isn't just bland truth and light, it is the most wondrous state of creation, that to be able to create, it's nice to listen to music even on record, not as nice as to listen to it live, which is not as good as listening to it by playing, being part of the whole thing, which is not as good as playing something that you've written yourself. And ultimately you get to the point that the most wondrous of all of the experiences is in the creation. That creation is a realization of non-being, a will to wake up. And that realization is accomplished through that internal division by the process of imagination. But the light goddess, or the light that represents the invisible power, is pure imagination. Anything that is an imagination, a concept or a principle or a thing, is not it. Those are sort of the shuckings. Those are the things that it drops off of itself. It comes to know, or it comes to realize by saying, I am not this. But in the process, it has created that. And the potential or possibility of knowing through shucking off what you aren't, that is the pure imagination, or that is the Divine Mother. It is also the light on a much higher level, more like the light that we experience when we realize the truth of something, when we think, we say, wow, that's true. But there is also a light that is common to all of those experiences of truth, and that light is the light of the pure imagination. So all of the forms and all of the colors that are shuckings are within the light of truth, within the light of pure imagination. And this will and this imagination are inseparable, because the imagination can't inform itself and say, I'm not this, without the will impressing it to do so. But on the other hand, the will has no way of expressing itself unless it has the infinitely impressive feminine that is an objectification of the ever unknown absolute feminine. So these are inseparable, infinite spiritual principles of divine will and imagination. When they unite, what gets shucked off is basically an idea, or a concept, or a principle. And that child, which is a union of the will to be and the imagination to not be, that child has to be like its parents. And that basic idea then is the idea in a concrete, even though it's infinite, concrete isn't the right term, a limited, or something that has a hole to it, that idea is the idea of God. The simplest idea is the idea of God. And the recognition of that idea by the two which are always infinite and are not tarnished or tainted or anything by that recognition is contemplation of self. Contemplation of self as divine. And when we ask, what are we? Or when we contemplate our being, or when we contemplate the nature of God, we're focusing always on that one basic, simple idea. But mind you, once you have two, once the one has recognized the potential that it is not, or that it might not be, once you have that internalized within the one, the two is internalized within the one, when you once have that, you have plurality. And when you have plurality, when God is born out of that which transcends God, that which is, as the Platonists would call it, intelligible. When God is born, gods are born, as well as everything else. So to the will to be of the one, that to that extent there are gods. To that extent there are differentiations. But not all of those differentiations are known. This contemplation is an ongoing process. There is the possibility of other gods. And so there is what one might say a distribution of divinity that takes place as part of the process of the contemplation of self in the union of will and imagination, of the recognition of existence and the realization of non-being through that kind of a process. There are all of the states that are in between. We recognize this as everything from quad to God, that there are all kinds of states of existence in between. And this is a really interesting thing, because once it has this divine characteristic, it has the possibility of realizing itself. Just as we have the possibility of realizing ourselves as God. And this is what we're going on. So then, the third in the triangle is God, and that is self-knowledge. And we've already gotten past more in my notes. I might get lost for a while, and I might have to go on a side trip here. Now, there are words that are. Okay. In the mathematical symbolism of spiritual mathematics, both the triangle and the circle have been used to represent spirit. The triangle represents the objectivity of spirit, and the circle represents more the eternality, or the momental, or the internal relationship, rather than the external objective relationship. Mathematically, the two are one. If we go right back to Masonry, in order to draw a circle, you have to have a triangle. And a compass, like this simple blackboard compass, is a triangle. And so, anytime we see a triangle, we see a circle. But we're doing this, they're necessarily interdependent. But just drawing the circle is, anybody who studied eurythmy knows that just drawing the circle is not just a simple process. You know, in the mathematics of Euclid, everybody went through all of the steps of Euclid's geometry as part of a spiritual initiation. And you didn't just prove theorems, you lived yourself into the realization of geometric principles. For example, in eurythmy classes, the first thing that happens with eurythmy students is that they form a group and they learn to relate to each other so that they can encircle. Not by painting any lines on the floor or anything like that. They learn to sense, or they learn to unify by sensing themselves as a circle. There are logical ways you can do it. If you want to do it, everybody could join hands and then stretch as far as you could with your hands, and assuming that everybody has about the same hands, you'd approximate a circle. That's a brute force mental way to do it, but it can be done in the spirit. Now, anytime we have created a triangle, we have created an infinite number of triangles, because we know every point that is within, and there is an infinite number of points within a triangle. And that triangle is objective no matter what plane we put it in. Whether we put it on the horizontal or on the vertical or any angle, that the same objectivity the objectivity once we have it is not lost. We know everything inside that triangle once we know that triangle. What I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to unify the counting of 1, 2, 3 together with the triangle. Because the 1 is associated with the point, which in this case, in the circle, is the point at the center, which is called the vertex. When you draw a circle, the line is profundity. I do it every time. Every time I want to prove that I understand or know something, God makes fun of me from within myself. So you think you're so smart, watch me make a fool of you. There's automatically within this circle, there is the tension of delineation in the radius, which is to say that it is the will of the one that it doesn't stay in itself, or if it does, it rays out, just like we talk. So there's an infinite number of rays, and so we have, to the ancients in mathematics, everything, every geometric figure that you can think of, any kind of curve, anything that is before your eye, anything that you can imagine, can be drawn by a point, a line, and a circle. And so when you have the 1, the 2, and the 3, you have the expression of the point being the vertex or the center of all things, and then the line as the differentiation, the number 2, the imaginative consciousness, and finally the limitation of the conception is everything out at the circumference. So this is a process where everything, each and every geometric form, every surface, everything we see is produced by the 1, the 2, and the 3. Once you can conceptualize something, once you can know something, once you can put something within the circle of your ability to conceive, which is an act of power, which is an act of wisdom and raying your imagination, and which has a unified limitation of your being. This is sort of like the extent of your aura. To the extent that you can manifest, that you can produce that circle, you can create anything in the cosmos. And when you're doing little geometric things like simple geometric constructions, that's what you're doing. When you're creating in your imagination, if you do visualization exercises, you're doing exactly the same thing. You're concentrating, and in that concentrating, you're projecting a force, and you're putting a limitation so that whatever you conceive comes out of the light, is made up of the light, and it is consolidated by the limit of your ability to hold your concentration and radiate that light so that it can be condensed into a form of existence. So that if you try to, in your own consciousness, you don't try to make an apple like you paint on a canvas. You materialize an apple from within. And you are both without and within that apple, and that apple comes out of the light of your consciousness, which depends to some extent on your faith in your own willpower and your willingness to continue to surround that willpower with your conceptual imagination. And when you realize your limitation, that you're not going to make all the apples at all, you're just making that one apple, is when you consolidate something. I've been trying for years to make a rose. For 30-some years to make a rose, and I'm getting there. I'm slowly, very, very slowly, in another 5 or 6 lifetimes, I will be able to do something like that. But we see then that this very process, which takes place in our creative work, or even when we're working from the outside in, this is the very way that spirit grows. It is a triangular process, whether we think of it geometrically, whether we think of it numerically, or whether we think of it in a compound arithmetic geometry in terms of encircling something or radiating something out from a center of being. This is where the one gets distributed to all things. All things that exist. And in that distribution, the points of that distribution, those vertices represent the unknown. They represent objectifications, theoretical objectifications of the unknown, and they are, how to say it, also they are distributed foci of self. They are the gods. How to say this and bring it all together? This whole process has been visualized by some people, literally, by semi-clairvoyant visions. There is a passage in the opening verses of Genesis saying, "And the face of God moved on the surface of the deep." And some people see that all of the hierarchies in something like a solar cosmos are projections from the one, and they're all faces, and all the cells and all the features are made up of faces, and are faces within faces, representing the expression of the different modes of character of the intelligence of the divine within, and that their common focus into the center of things is what lights the light of the sun at the center of the whole business. That is a figurative as well as a quasi-formal type of clairvoyant vision, but what it represents is the very thing of reflecting back from the divinity that is in all of the points that are out on that radius, out on that circumference, or all of the circumferences from the center out, that it is in the process of sustaining that projection and in seeing the divine in that projection or through the divines in that projection back in, that everything gets lit up. This whole process, we said a long time ago that this is a great vision, or this is a great dream, and it's also a great, as the alchemist said, it was the great experiment. This is the experiment of trying to know the unknown. And the way it is realized is through the imagination. We've said it before that there is an illusion, a very big illusion in all of this, in that the divine projects a dream. But it projects that dream in such a way that it plays for keeps. It imagines for keeps. And that total self-sacrifice, the giving of the being of self, because remember that the first thing that is realized when the third is realized is the being of Godhood. When that is totally given to everything else in creation, when that sacrifice is given in creation, that is what realizes the dream. You give up all of your life for that which appears to be illusion, or that which appears to be a phony. And a lot of people who are phonies, that by giving yourself to them, they turn out to be very real people. And that whole process is what takes the illusion, or takes the dream and makes it a reality. And that is where the cosmos takes things of the unknown and what it isn't. Those shuckings off of the imagination of what it isn't, those things are illusions, but those things are the very things that are realized. And that is how we come to experience. And so we are now very much out, as far out just about as one can get on the circumference, and be self-conscious. There is within us the sacrifice of the divine, that we ourselves can indeed become the gods. That potential, that seed that is within us, by the sacrifice of that and our conscious participation in the sacrifice, we become the divine. So, when Oedipus is standing out on the out in the courtyard of the palace and talking to the people and asking them questions about the truth. Yes, there is illusion, and yes, there is common sense, and yes, there is a lot that is phony, but what it is a replication of a divine process. And so democracy, even though due to our fallacies, because we've added phoniness on top of phoniness, it wasn't that there is the problem of illusion, it's that we've loved the illusion more than the reality, because we don't want the things to come to life. We want them to be the same all the time. Never let this change. Let us have immortality. Let Lucifer talk to us and have us become immortal by being able to use the sex force to perpetuate, so that we're always going to be the same. We've taken the illusion and we have made it not a reality. We've made a secondary illusion out of it. But at any rate, when Oedipus is standing out in the courtyard and he's saying to the people, what is the truth? I need to know the truth from you. And when people take surveys, I think the surveys are part of the